Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak here this evening. Has the screen shared okay? Can you see the screen?
Yes, that's
Great,
shared. Thank you.
thank you. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about the history of Lowestoft Porcelain, the only porcelain factory in East Anglia, and it was trading for around 44 years, from approximately 1757 to 1801. Within the fascinating and international story of porcelain, it plays a small but important role, a supreme example of successful 18th century enterprise. The manufacturers were able to position themselves within a newly established tradition, and they have the ability to understand and work with a market, and also the ability to interpret fashions in a new type of decorative domestic object, without ever overreaching themselves financially or stylistically. To begin with an introduction to what porcelain is. The means to achieve any type of ceramic depends on two basic things: the right raw materials, clays and minerals available, and the means, i.e. the fuel and the technology, the ability to design and build kilns, to fire them to the correct temperature and in the correct way. Cultures where there is a perennial shortage of fuel are going to be less likely to develop ceramics. The term porcelain can actually refer to several variations on a basic recipe, depending on where and when it has been made. But what it simply means is a ceramic made of a particular type of clay known as kaolin or china clay, mixed with a particular type of ground stone called petunse or china stone. They are both derivatives of the same mineral, feldspar. This is fired at around 1300 degrees centigrade, so that both elements in the mixture fuse together to produce a very fine white ceramic with a glassy surface. This is different from earthenware, both because it is made of a different type of material and fired at a higher temperature. Glaze sits on top of earthenware, whereas in the case of porcelain, because it becomes fused with the clay itself, it produces a much finer, smoother and more homogeneous surface. Porcelain is also harder than earthenware and more impermeable to liquids. Porcelain goes back a very long way. It originated in China because China is naturally rich in the right kinds of raw materials for ceramics, so people began to use what was at hand from an early date. The most prestigious objects in early China were made of bronze, but because there was less metal and more clay and wood, ceramics gradually took over. Some wares of porcelainous type have been traced back as far as the 6th century CE. Chinese potters gradually developed the technology to fire their kilns to the very high temperatures needed for porcelain, hundreds of years before Westerners achieved the same. In the slide, I've got an example of an early sophisticated piece of Chinese porcelain, which looks extraordinarily modern. Needless to say, we do not have examples of this kind of ware in Norwich Castle, but this is from the V&A's collection. Porcelain began to be exported to Europe gradually from the 15th century onwards. One sees the first appearances of porcelain in Western paintings, like this one, The Adoration of the Magi by Andrea Mantegna. If you look, you can see one of the Magi is holding a porcelain cup full of gold coins, and you can gather that this porcelain cup is a symbol in this painting of both preciousness, exoticism, and rarity, which indeed it was at the time. In the 16th century, you see porcelain mounted in gold and silver, as you see here, to further enhance its value and prestige. But the founding of the East India companies meant that more and more began to be exported. Firstly, for royalty and nobility only, as it was extremely expensive. The Portuguese were the first East India Company, establishing trading links with China from the 1520s. Then the Dutch Company, then the English in the early 17th century. We have in the collections at Norwich this mazer mounted in Norwich silver. You can see that the wooden mazer doesn't fit the silver band all that well, and that strongly implies that there was a different vessel inside it originally, which may well have been Chinese porcelain. If so, it's evidence for porcelain in Norwich from an early date, mid-1620s. Other luxury objects, such as painted silks, and even more importantly, tea, accompanied porcelain to Europe and helped to develop Western taste for high-status objects from the Eastern world. The story of porcelain, in whatever part of the world it travelled to, is the story of social status and human desire as much as anything else. And certain individuals were initially instrumental in spreading the love of it and covetousness for it at various points in time. In Holland and later England from the 1670s, Queen Mary II was an important figure for establishing the taste for porcelain. At first, for collecting it in a cabinet, which then meant a small room, not a cupboard. This design shows what an early cabinet would have looked like. If you look closely in this engraving, you can see the porcelain all around the room. This was a typical collecting cabinet of the late 17th to early 18th century. But Queen Mary's love of the collecting ensured it became high fashion, especially amongst noble women. And this new fashion fostered designs made especially for export to appeal to European taste. And of course, it also spawned European imitations, and isolated attempts were made to create porcelain with greater or lesser success. One of the best known early attempts at porcelain was the so-called Medici porcelain, made in Italy in the 16th century. They made a valiant attempt at creating porcelain with a fine white earthenware clay mixed with quartz, but it didn't have the same sturdiness to its body, and this is one of the rare pieces which survive. A lot of them they collapsed in the kilns, so it didn't catch on. And it was not until the early 18th century that a really viable recipe for porcelain was first found in Europe. The Meissen factory in Saxony, which is now Germany, produced the first porcelains around 1713. This was a monumental achievement and only came about because the ruler of Saxony, Augustus the Strong, adored porcelain. He had a vast collection of Chinese wares, and he was determined it was going to happen in his home region. So he paid for and basically pressurized an alchemist and chemist to work on the formula, and it took 20 years before he was successful. Porcelain was almost like the computer technology of its day. In the 18th century, fortunes could be made and lost over discovering the secret of how to make the new material. And in Europe, the demand for porcelain was intense. The first English porcelain factories of Chelsea, Worcester, and Bow were set up in the 1740s and 1750s. They tried to copy the hard paste porcelain made in China, Japan, and in Europe, but they did not have access to the correct ingredients, nor were able to achieve a quite high enough firing temperature. The answer was to imitate these products with what was known as soft paste. The main difference with the soft paste is that its lower firing temperature of 1050 degrees centigrade means it is not quite as hard and glassy as hard paste, nor is it as impermeable to hot liquids. Until the end of the 18th century, all English porcelain, including that made at Lowestoft, was a soft paste. All the early English porcelain factories had a slightly different character, each aimed at a slightly different clientele, and they were more or less artistically, technically, and commercially successful. To set the Lowestoft factory in context, it can't be said to be the most artistically sophisticated, but they were technically very consistent and one of the most successful factories of the 18th century. The factory was established in Lowestoft in Suffolk between 1757 and 59. An early written account by Edmund Gillingwater, entitled An Historical Account of the Ancient Town of Lowestoft, in 1790, while the factory was still in production. He stated that a man named Hewling Lewson found a fine clay suitable for making soft paste porcelain on his estate in Gunton, north of Lowestoft, in 1756. And he set up a kiln and the furnace. In those days, you could only really make porcelain if you had the raw materials locally. Transporting clay too far was too difficult and expensive. The first attempt to manufacture porcelain apparently failed, supposedly sabotaged by workers brought from London, although the truth of this is not known. When the factory was set up in Lowestoft in 1757, it too was allegedly the victim of intentional sabotage by staff employed by rival manufacturers. At this point, knowledge of the manufacturing process was new and recipes were experimental. According to family tradition, Robert Brown, one of the partners in the factory and its first manager, had discovered a satisfactory recipe for making porcelain by getting a job at the Bow factory in London. The story goes that he pretended to be a simpleton, hid in a barrel one night and spied on his employers making up the secret mixture. This story seems melodramatically unlikely, but it shows how important and subject to mystique porcelain recipes were. And chemical analysis has also shown that the combination of clay, oxbone ash, and crushed flint used at Lowestoft was similar to the Bow factory's recipe. Workers did move from one factory to another, so someone may have imported the Bow factory recipe. Factories in other parts of the country used soapstone instead of flint, but it always made most sense commercially to use what was nearest at hand, and flint was abundant in the East Anglian region. Despite these accounts, the precise date of the beginning of the factory is not proven, but an advert in the Norwich Mercury in January 1760 states, "Notice is hereby given to all dealers in porcelain or chinaware that by or before Lady Day next will be offered to sale a great variety of neat blue and white china or porcelain at the manufactory in this town. It is humbly hoped that most of the shopkeepers in this county and the county of Norfolk will give encouragement to this laudable undertaking by reserving their spring orders for their humble servants, Walker & Co." A similar advert appeared in an Ipswich newspaper around the same time, signalling this was the first big commercial launch of the product. Although the factory must have been in production for at least a couple of years, establishing their techniques, experimenting with designs, and producing a good range of saleable items. As the advert says, Lowestoft's earliest wares were available in underglaze blue. To start production with monochrome blue and white made the best commercial sense, and it's typical of the Lowestoft proprietors that they made this choice. Cobalt oxide is one of the earliest minerals ever to be used for a coloured ceramic glaze. It was and is very closely associated in the minds of Europeans with Chinese porcelain, but in fact the first use of cobalt was not Chinese, but used by Iraqi potters in the 9th century to decorate white tin-glazed earthenware. White porcelain wares decorated with underglazed cobalt blue first became common in China around the early 14th century. It is a perennially useful pigment for ceramics decoration because it can withstand high firing temperatures needed for porcelain, and it gives a good, reliable dark blue once fired, and it is therefore economical, involving less risk than overglaze enamel colours, which are more expensive in terms of materials, labour and fuel. And also, coloured pigments were more likely to fire incorrectly and produced fewer saleable pieces. The Lowestoft proprietors may have been the only porcelain factory in East Anglia, and they were not making wares aimed at the aristocracy, but they were clearly well aware of trends in this newly established art form. Blue and white was closely associated with Chinese porcelain, which was still most people's idea of what porcelain should look like. This early vase is a Chinese shape and likely wants to have been part of a garniture, a group of 3, 5 or 7 vases used to decorate a mantelpiece, which was fashionable to ornament a chinoiserie interior. This elegant vase, with its simple and fairly cheap to produce monochrome design, would have been one way for a middle-class home to display the latest fashions. But another important early influence on Lowestoft style is that of Delftware, the tin-glazed earthenware made in both Holland and the UK, which had been the cheaper alternative to Chinese porcelain during the 17th century and into the 18th. Of course, there were many Chinese influences too in Delft. So here is an example of a couple of early 18th century Delftware vases, one Dutch, one English. Both have been, which would probably have come from Delftware garnitures. This type of ware would have been very familiar in Norfolk, especially due to the Dutch and Flemish immigrants for 150 years. The first Delft in the UK was in fact made in Norwich by 2 Flemish potters in the 16th century. By the mid-18th century, the patterns on blue and white, whether Delft or porcelain, were extremely hybrid. The fisherman on this Lowestoft dish is quite a Dutch style in design, but the stylized trees around him have a more Chinese appearance. The Lowestoft factory was combining the new with the more familiar. To those who purchased it, especially if it was the first porcelain they had bought, it would have given a sense of upgrading to a more prestigious material, but without losing sight of a familiar style. Among other early Lowestoft wares were those in shapes already made in silver, similar, although simpler, to those inaugurated by the fashionable London Chelsea factory. These include this cream boat seen here. If we compare this cream boat with these two Chelsea cream boats, we can see the relationship, the stylistic relationship between them. The Lowestoft designers clearly had an awareness of the trends established by Chelsea, even though the moulding is less crisp and the painting less detailed. The mix of both moulding and painting on the same item is typical of that time. In the mid-18th century, the Rococo style was the height of fashion. This style originated in France, but included a delicate and fanciful interpretation of chinoiserie, such as seen here in this pattern book by John Pillemont, which was published in 1755. Rococo, in many ways, was well suited to interpretation in porcelain. The asymmetric shapes translated well, and in polychrome wares, light and sugary colour palettes could be interpreted with enamels and gilding, whether to produce domestic wares or ornamental figures. An example of Lowestoft use of the Rococo chinoiserie we can see here, the shape of the asymmetric cartouche on this blue and white dish, and also this wall-mounted flower vase. Here we can see the elements that we saw earlier in the Rococo design, the lightness and delicacy, the sense of defying gravity, and the asymmetry. In fact, the shape of this flower vase is taken from a Delft shape and is not Chinese. It may be interpreted more simply, but all the elements are there. Similarly, a more utilitarian object like this inkwell also shows awareness of Rococo chinoiserie. This little man fishing seen on the right is quite different in style from the Dutch-derived fisherman on the pierced bowl we saw earlier, and the asymmetric scrollwork is quite Rococo in shape. The initials RB here stand for Robert Brown, and this brings us to another important, unique fact about Lowestoft wares. There are more surviving inscribed and dated wares produced by this factory than by any other in the 18th century. This has given scholars the opportunity to trace a proportion of the purchasers of Lowestoft and find out who the main consumers were. The 18th century was a fascinating time in the context of the growth of what we would recognise as modern consumerism and the rise of the middle classes. The growth of consumer goods meant that the ideas of refinement and good taste were becoming more important to more people. For example, ownership of household items like mirrors, clocks, and curtains, only within reach of the very richest at the beginning of the 18th century, were well represented in homes of the middle class too, well before the end of this century. The awareness of distinctions between classes was not just confined to wealth as represented by gold. In the past, a medieval lord had displayed his gold and silver vessels as a display of raw power. Metal vessels could be melted down into coin. The raw materials of ceramics were not comparable to this because not intrinsically valuable. You could pay a lot for them, but you couldn't melt them down to pay your army. But they represented a more modern concept of sophistication, good taste, and gentility. Porcelain was also a luxury on a sliding scale, as the prices did vary. Lowestoft wares must have offered a welcome opportunity for a luxury within the reach of a middle-class clientele. Blue and white was cheaper than polychrome, so there was a range of prices available. So who bought Lowestoft porcelain? From the customers named in the inscriptions who have been identified, it seems that the mercantile classes formed a large proportion of the purchasers. For example, in this slide of this mug, Edward Amond was the landlord of the Rising Sun Inn in Wyndham, in Lowestoft, in Wyndham. And William Liddell from Crostwick in 1774 was a farmer. And we have other examples of prosperous tradesmen, grocers, butchers, pub landlords, and so on. These were the kind of people who perhaps would not have been able to afford the highest fashion items, but who were prosperous enough to pay 3 pennies for a blue and white tea bowl. It was very interesting to find out how much porcelain some of these people owned, but that kind of information does not really survive. But the nature of some of these objects, such as this tobacco dish, owned by Henry Trull, the Norwich grocer, who had a shop in Haymarket in the centre of Norwich, does suggest it might have formed an advert for him. It could have sat on his shop counter with samples of tobacco. Although the image, of course, of the enslaved African worker is a sad and offensive reminder today of how tobacco was then being produced, the dish helped to advertise Trull's establishment. And one wonders whether the mugs owned by pub landlords had a similar purpose. As well as local names, one sees recognisable local scenery as well. This is a particularly rare and important pair of a water flask known as a guglet and bowl. And if you look closely at these, there's Lowestoft Church in the middle, and there are various other scenes of landmarks around Lowestoft. Extremely beautiful object. Even more localized were these charming plaques, which seem to have been unique to the Lowestoft factory, that are known as birth tablets. These seemed mainly to be made to commemorate births into the families of the workers at the factory, since the same names reoccur. But they are a touching personal feature of the factory's output, especially this one, which is the only example of its type we've got. These are two sides of the same tablet, and they record a birth on one side and a death on the other. At the other end of the spectrum, there are also some intriguing examples of very different styles of decoration. This dish, which on the reverse has an inscription, Elizabeth Buckle, 1768, is both the only known example of this shape and this extremely unusual pattern. We do know the source of the pattern. It comes from this 17th century Dutch travel book by Johan Neuhoff, with engravings by Wenceslas Holler, first translated into English in 1669. The illustrations are extremely interesting as a 17th century Dutch take on chinoiserie. If Jean Pillemont, who we saw earlier, is archetypal Rococo, is an archetypal Rococo's take on the style. Neuhoff's Chinese figures are like characters in a 17th century Dutch genre painting. And it illustrates that the Lowestoft decorators were aware of a wide range of sources, although the fact that this is the only known example from this book suggests it must have been a special order. And this is an odd design to choose. And Elizabeth Buckle, we know, was an aunt of one of the main decorators and designers at the factory, Robert Allen, who lived in Lowestoft all her life. We do not know why this pattern would have been used for her. It's one of those intriguing mysteries. In order to keep up with the latest trends, it was essential that the factory also began to produce polychrome or multicolored wares. A precise date when they began to make these more expensive wares is not firmly established, but probably the greatest scholar of Lowestoft porcelain, the late John Howell, suggested the mid-1760s for the first experiments in this area. As there is a single mug in the collection of Ipswich museums dated 1766, which has decoration painted in black, not cobalt blue. When the factory's first manager, Robert Brown, died in 1771, his son, also Robert, took over as manager. It was probably at this time that polychrome porcelain was put into full production. Polychrome pieces were decorated with a series of enamel colours painted on top of the glaze. Each colour had to be fired separately at a particular temperature in a special kiln. The colour which needed the highest temperature was fired first, then the heat was reduced for each subsequent colour, with gilding added last as it fired at the lowest temperature. It seems likely that the first enamel decoration was rather experimental, using single colours, either black or pink or both together, as we've seen here, probably to test the market, as before they risked the extra outlay of adding more colours. The magenta pink might seem an odd choice, but in fact it was extremely fashionable in the 1760s, and again it shows the Lowestoft manufacturers' awareness of international trends and their ability to interpret them intelligently. This unusually large teapot, possibly a punch pot, is in fact a close copy of a Meissen design, the style in both its colour and its style of flowers, as we can see by comparing it with this Meissen chocolate pot. It is recognisably the same colour. The two are recognisably the same colour and in the same idiom. If you also compare this Lowestoft teapot with pink classical style ruins, this Meissen dish of classical ruins with cupids, you can again see the similarities. These wares made only one or two colours would have been less expensive than full colour wares, but would still have made a customer feel in tune with the latest styles. Lowestoft porcelain was being sold successfully in London at an outlet in Aldermanbury in the city as early as 1763. This not only meant a way of ensuring publicity and sales beyond the immediate region, but was also a means to keep abreast of the fashions. The 18th century is the first time we begin to get the idea that shopping was becoming a fashionable leisure pursuit, especially for ladies. And so the appearance of shops selling goods like porcelain was becoming increasingly important. The writer Daniel Defoe commented rather disapprovingly as early as 1720 on the modern custom of tradesmen laying out 2/3 of their fortune on fitting up their shops, including painting and gilding, fine shelves, shutters, boxes, glass doors, sash windows, and the like. The highest class establishments of 18th century London were in the West End. The retail outlet which sold Lowestoft's wares was among the second rung of establishments further east, and we don't know what it looked like, but it would have had to have had a presence, and it would have meant that representatives of the firm travelled to London regularly, where they would have observed the latest London styles. For example, once full-colour polychrome wares were in production, one of their early pieces was this teapot. And we can see how similar in style it is to this teapot from the Bow factory. Although looking closely at the Lowestoft example, if you look at the leaves, the small leaves which are seen in the middle of the pot, above and below the orange fence, we can see we can see the leaves of this colour have slightly misfired, suggesting it's an early piece, and it's unusual in style for Lowestoft. It's much more typical of Bow, and that suggests they were experimenting. The bulk of the factory's production, as is suggested by the range of images I've shown so far, was domestic ware, particularly tea and coffee services. Another offshoot of the growing market for luxury goods from abroad was the rapid spread in the popularity of tea. Again, through the century, the price of tea fell, halving in price between 1690 to 1760, leading to a huge growth in demand, and the increasing demand for tea services, more outlets for selling porcelain, and a new form of refined activity, the tea party. Probably the largest number of items from a single tea service surviving is from what is known as the Jodrell service, as a couple of examples seen here. Probably one of the most elegant services and the most expensive, as all the pieces are gilded. It was named for the Jodrell family, baronets of Saul Park and later Bayfield Hall in North Norfolk, showing how a top-of-the-range service could appeal to local aristocracy just as well as to the middle class. This design, although interpreted in fashionable Rococo pinks, reds and gold, with more figurative flowers and thus more Europeanized, is actually a more or less straight copy of a Chinese original, seen here. This pattern was copied much more frequently at the Worcester porcelain factory, and is only known to have been used at Lowestoft on one other item, apart from this one, an early teapot. We know quite a bit about the workers at the Lowestoft factory. Men, women and children worked there, and some family names recur throughout the firm's history. However, ironically, the identity of the person who probably painted the Jodrell tea service and some of the best quality polychrome wares produced by Lowestoft remains unknown. This mug and these two, one of a set of 3, made for J and E Tanton, Norwich 1774, John Tanton being a carpenter in Bear Street, include noticeably high quality naturalistic floral painting. The painter is known as the tulip painter because tulips seem to be his speciality. The depiction of detailed naturalistic flowers, like a botanical drawing, as opposed to stylized Oriental style flowers, had originated at Meissen and was continued at the Chelsea factory. As you can see from this example, there's a rather beautiful, if not very naturalistic in colour, blue and red tulip on the top right-hand side in this silver dish. And the tulip painter's work is clearly Lowestoft's adaptation of this trend. However, no datable examples of this painter's work exist beyond the late 1770s. So it seems likely that this painter either died, retired, or moved away. Oops, don't know how that's happened. I've moved this slide around several times and it still persists on it appearing sideways. I do apologize. I was going to say other early polychrome designs included both naturalistic and Chinese figure scenes. The Chinese scenes are typified by the stylized figure groupings seen here. The latter occur more frequently, as they must have been easier to produce. This vase is one of 5, which represents a rare surviving polychrome garniture. One trend into which Lowestoft did not venture very frequently was that of decorative figures, both human or animal. They were a very important part of the output of other factories, both continental and English, and there was clearly a market for them. Meissen was especially famous for its beautiful figures, like this extraordinary goat, one of the most amazing figures to survive anywhere. Under the auspices of its royal patron, Meissen had employed some of the best sculptors in Europe. This type of figure was copied and adapted, if less finely, at Chelsea and Bow. Worcester and Derby were also noted for their figures. For a long time, it was disputed whether any figures at all were produced at Lowestoft, many scholars arguing that they were not. Examining broken shards and waste from the factory site, however, an example of how archaeology is so valuable to ceramic scholarship, did show that figures were indeed made there. How many figures, what type, and how long for is still disputed. Many surviving figures, such as this one, bear a strong similarity to those made at the Bow factory, and some have suggested that when the Bow factory closed down in 1774, Lowestoft had bought some of their figure moulds. This did happen relatively frequently. Commodities like moulds and pattern books changed hands when factories closed or were taken over, and it is one of the factors which can make identification of factories difficult. It seems likely, however, that the Lowestoft proprietors realised that if they were going to compete seriously in the market for figures, they would have had to invest in a sculptor who could create the original models, and they would need more moulds, more space, and more kilns. The factory was never a large concern relative to some others, being valued for insurance at £300 in the 1760s, compared with Bow, which was valued at £1,800 at around the same time. And it may have been that they decided, in the pragmatic way that was characteristic of them, not to attempt more than the occasional foray into this area. From the 1780s on, most of Lowestoft designs in both polychrome and blue and white became more formulaic. The spread of transfer printing in the early 1770s had meant it was now possible to reproduce blue and white wares much more cheaply and quickly than had ever been possible before, like this one, for example. Polychrome wares, although some fine quality pieces were clearly still being produced on special order, tended from the 1780s on to fall into 2 groups, known as Curtis patterns and Redgrave patterns, after 2 families of painters who worked at the factory. The Curtis pattern, as seen here on this example of a teapot, is attractive and occurs in many different forms. It's characterized by this pink, red and green palette and a kind of cross-hatched pink or purple scale work surrounded by flowers, whether sprigs or flowers in baskets, as seen here. Variations on this pattern and this colour scheme are sometimes found on a large group of late wares known as the trifles, which reflect Lowestoft's growing popularity as a seaside resort. Note that the mug on the left is not porcelain, unusually, but creamware. Towards the end of the factory's life, they were also buying in blanks from elsewhere to paint, although creamware is unusual. The so-called red-grey patterns were very loosely based on Japanese imari pattern, so-called imari, which is, I've got an example, is there. You can see the relationship. Although they are crude and relatively speaking, and it has been suggested that they might have been painted by the older child employees of the factory, since only simple copying was required. A great number of these wares survive in variations on these themes, in the characteristic red, blue and gold colourway. To look finally at some of the higher quality late polychrome wares, these include this attractive jug, clearly made for a wedding. If you look on the top of the right-hand slide, you can see the name Jeremiah Warner. He was clearly a miller, but we don't know who he was. And this charming flask, which has a picture on one side, of all things, of a bathing machine. This, like the trifles range, reflects Lowestoft's growing status as a resort. It was one of the first seaside towns in the modern sense, and well known for the quality of its air and its healthy aspect. According to contemporary evidence, the first bathing machine was seen in Lowestoft in 1768 and was popular, so others were built soon after. Sea bathing, like taking spa water, was considered good for the health, which is why taking a trip to a seaside resort developed as a gentrified leisure pursuit. This kind of decoration is a testament to the importance of local input to Lowestoft's products. This flask, with its bathing machine on one side and a harbour scene on the other, was an up-to-date celebration of Lowestoft's advantages as a coastal town. The last special order piece of note in the factory's life in our collection was also of maritime origin, the so-called Camperdown bowl. The bowl is painted with a scene of the Battle of Camperdown, which took place on the 11th of October 1797. It represented a famous victory over the Dutch navy by Admiral Duncan, who had been appointed commander of the North Sea Fleet 2 years earlier. In this capacity, he would frequently have passed through the Norfolk ports of Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn, and indeed the Camperdown bowl shows the cutter active, bringing news of the Dutch fleet at sea to Duncan, where he was revictualling his fleet in Yarmouth Roads. As a result of his victory over the Dutch, Duncan was raised to the peerage as Viscount Duncan of Camperdown. The early provenance of this bowl is unknown, but it may have been commissioned to commemorate the battle by Admiral Duncan himself, or for one of the other naval commanders involved in the engagement. The detailed representation of the Battle of Camperdown, showing both Dutch and English ships with cannons firing, is certainly based on a contemporary engraving. There are a couple of candidates which it might be. If an illustrative source is definitively proved, this will enable a more precise production date to be established between the date of the battle in 1797 and the closure of the Lowestoft factory in 1801. This production date places the bowl among one of the last significant pieces of documentary porcelain to have been produced by the factory, although the last piece of inscribed and dated ware is a birth tablet in the collection at Norwich, bearing the date 1799. The decoration of this bowl is attributed to Robert Allen, who was responsible for the majority of the best decoration found on Lowestoft porcelain, and particularly for maritime scenes from the later period. Allen worked at the factory from its earliest days around 1757, probably being first employed as a decorator at the age of 12. He continued in the employment of the factory until it closed in 1801, although sources indicate that by the early 1790s he also had his own china shop in Lowestoft. So what led to the demise of the Lowestoft factory in 1801? Basically, it was two factors: technology and changing fashions. In the field of porcelain technology, things had not stood still during the last quarter of the 18th century. A chemist from Plymouth called William Cookworthy discovered sources of china clay and china stone in Cornwall. These were the necessary ingredients of true hard-paste porcelain. Cookworthy took out a patent in 1768, and by 1770 had sold the rights of his patent to the Bristol factory. This factory operated until 1781, then the recipe for hard paste was sold to a group of Staffordshire factories, chief among which was New Hall. Their patent expired in 1796, leading to many other factories starting to make the tougher hard paste porcelain, which quickly took over from soft paste in popularity. The Lowestoft managers must have realised that if they wanted to compete, they would need to invest heavily in the new technology, new kilns which would fire to the higher temperature, and there were also far more factories against which to compete. At the same time, fashions in decoration had changed. The Rococo style had given way to the neoclassical. And although the Lowestoft wares of the late 1790s, as you can see here, reflect the new fashions for sprigged decoration and for fluted vessels in white and gold, which echoed the shapes of classical columns, they were clearly not sufficiently distinctive to stand out amongst all the other wares now available. So the partners wound up the business in 1801. Some of the employees moved to Worcester to work at Robert Chamberlain's factory, producing hard paste porcelain. But the majority probably went back to work in Lowestoft's other industries. So to conclude, in this talk, I've aimed to place the Lowestoft factory in its context within English porcelain manufacture. It played an important role in spreading the demand for porcelain. It was commercially successful for half a century and made a wide range of wares to appeal to both middle-class and upper-class tastes, and was expert at taking international trends and interpreting them in attractive yet practical and economically viable ways. Lowestoft porcelain was a true success story of the 18th century. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Francesca. I'll now see if we have some questions. Let's see. So we have a question here from Elizabeth Talbot, who says that given that Lowestoft was a thriving port, was much Lowestoft porcelain exported, or was it primarily retained by the UK home market?
Actually, yes, quite a lot of it was exported, especially as one would imagine via Holland. And it was quite interesting what happened to it once it was exported. Some of it ended up in France, and people thought it was Chinese porcelain. The study of just how much Lowestoft porcelain was exported and where it went is quite a distinct area of research, and I'm it's not something I know very much about, and I don't think much research has been done, but it did get confused with Chinese porcelain.
Oh, interesting.
But yes, a thriving export business they had.
So I imagine that occasionally items must come up for auction or appear in sort of, yeah, it's interesting.
They do, yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the sort of reference they would use for the porcelain. So, would printed reference materials for pattern books or printed form, how rare and prized would that be for the
Well,
Lowestoft Porcelain factory, or factories in general in the UK?
I think they must have used a lot of printed material as pattern reference. Um, I mean, it's very rare for pattern books themselves to survive, especially in the 18th century. Um, Even in the 19th century, there isn't a great deal. Um, but we have a direct, I mean, in the 17th century style Dutch uh, vision of chinoiserie on the Elizabeth Buckle bowl. I mean, that is a direct copy
Hmm.
from this early 17th century Dutch travel book, which shows us that we did. That they must have used that particular book for that pattern, although we don't know why. Whether they had, it may be that the managers who went to London and elsewhere, or the continent, would have picked up pattern books, books of prints, and brought them back for their workers. I would think that would be the most
Hmm.
likely thing. Um, whether other manufacturers would have allowed them to sketch their wares is unlikely. I would think they wouldn't want to
No.
give away their fashions, and no mobile phones in those days to take a quick picture when nobody was looking.
So would the managers of the factory, would they have travelled quite frequently overseas, or
We don't really know, but I mean, they must have done. Some people must have done, because there was such a strong awareness of European fashions. Obviously, there would have been some of it available in London for sale. Um, but exactly how I mean, we can see that transmission of patterns occurred widely, but the exact routes by which that happened,
hmm.
it's frustratingly unclear.
Ah,
And we haven't got convenient archives left of that kind of material to tell us either.
oh, that's a shame. It's a shame. Ah, so I think we've got another question in the chat. Let's see. So somebody has asked, would individual painters have an influence on the pictures painted, or was it purely market driven?
Again, I'm not sure that's something we know. What we do know is that certain painters specialized in certain types of painting. Excuse me. um One person always did maritime scenes, um others did floral. So that they would have been kind of taken on to do those specific things, but we don't know enough about what that how the working life in the factory operated. Though what we also do know um is that sometimes two different people worked on the same piece. um we have one large jug in the collection at Norwich, which is not on display at the moment, but it was clearly painted by two people, because the styles are quite different. It's a has a multicolored design of both flowers, which is quite good, and a pink cherub, which is not very good. And it looks as though the pink cherub is too big for the space left for him by the um floral painter. So it looks as if it's been a bit of a commercial disaster, and the
Hmm.
style of the painting is so different that it must have been done by two different people.
Ah. So with a question here, is there any evidence that there was more than one kiln in the Lowestoft factory?
That I don't know, I'm afraid. If there's somebody here from the Lowestoft Museum, they may know more about the position of the kilns. I mean, there is a substantial group of kind of ceramic wasters and kiln props and stilts and material from the factory, but the industrial side of it is not something that I have studied.
Someone is also asking, some some pieces have painters' numbers on the bases.
Yes.
What do these reference?
Well, we don't always know. One theory is that they were referencing each painter put their individual number, because potters and painters were paid by the success of their pieces, so they could say, oh yes, number 5 has done six pieces today, he'll get paid such and such. But if that is the case, then one wonders why they didn't all have numbers on, only a proportion do. So again, it's a slightly mysterious thing. Occasionally, I mean, there is no Lowestoft mark, as it were, but you do occasionally see what looks like a little crescent moon symbol. But that appears on several different porcelain manufacturers' wares, and it may be thought of as just being a sign of quality rather than particularly wanting to indicate a special factory, for one factory or another.
Oh, I see. So I was wondering myself, how direct would the Dutch Flemish influence have been on the Lowestoft porcelain? I mean, would they have known Dutch or Flemish people at all?
Well, quite possibly, and certainly, unlike Chinese porcelain, there would have been a lot of it around. I mean, we do know, obviously, that there were a great many Dutch and Flemish immigrants around, and they brought their pottery over with them. And the tin glazed earthenware known as Delftware was being made in England by the early 18th century. In fact, it was made during the 17th, as well as being imported from Holland. And that there would have been plenty around to copy, unlike Chinese porcelain, which wouldn't have been around so kind of obviously or so frequently. But then again, the Delftware itself, as I said earlier, copied Chinese wares as well.
Right.
So you get transmission of patterns back and forth. So you do get a lot of hybridity.
Oh, interesting. So we have another question here. Let's just see. So there's a question here that says, what is the likelihood that porcelain items in remote collections are Lowestoft but have not been correctly attributed?
Well, it depends on the item and what you mean by remote, I suppose. I mean, it could have got, items do get surprising long way. Things can get all around the world without us quite knowing how. Things pass from collection to collection. I mean, Lowestoft isn't, I mean, a lot of the factories copied each other. A lot of them, the patterns are not dissimilar, but there are, definite features. You can tell by the style of painting, the different shades of porcelain and glaze. Some have a more bluish tinge or a more grayish tinge. And that all those help identify the objects of particular individual factories. So yes, I mean, you would need to look at each individual piece and try and decide what it was, and obviously handling helps, because even the textures of the bases of vessels vary between factories. I mean, every little detail can help identify something.
So I suppose Lowestoft porcelain, it's there are new things possibly to discover that we don't
I'm
already
sure there
know.
are.
And I'm sure
Yes.
there's plenty of things that we'll just never know.
No, and
No.
I mean, things do tend to pop up now and again. I mean, there was a piece on sale at auction at, I think it was Woolly and Wallace down in Salisbury recently, which was a dish which had a blue and white image of a flower in the style of a kind of a botanical print, which isn't something that the Lowestoft factory was particularly known for. I'd never seen anything quite like that before. But obviously it must have been a special order.
Yeah.
Occasionally you just see things and go, oh gosh, is that Lowestoft? So it is.
Yeah.
You know, and it's nice always to be surprised by different things, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Anyway, I really
that's okay.
appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time today. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Much
No
appreciated.
worries. No worries.